So welcome to the summary of Module 6, the UI Design Style Guide. Here we learned about the classes and ID, when to use, when not to use, what they are, actually the similarities and all of that. We learned about the margin, padding, and gap, which in other words is called the gutter. We learned about the flex box and we learned about the CSS grid. In the classes and ID, we understood that when a class is added to an element, automatically that particular class carries a property of styling that can be transferred to another element that have the same class. So for instance, we added the same class of div rounded to these two elements, and it means that we can change their style, their sizes, whatever element they have right inside them. The text color, we can also do that with all elements inside it. And we specifically pointed out that you can use multiple classes for multiple elements or for singular elements. And we talked about the ID being the parent controller of the class, which means if we want to make a different color from the first one or a different property from the first and possibly the text size of the first one to be larger than the second one without affecting that, we can actually do that. But whenever we go to that particular property of that ID and clear out that function, automatically it will inherit the property of the class. Okay, that is what we learned about the classes and ID. Now we learned about margin and padding. That's very simple. We talked about the space between an element outside is the margin, and the space within an element is called the padding, whether left or right, top and bottom, wherever it is. You can also control the padding and margin from selecting the element you want to control, going to advanced, go to size and spacing. Here inside of the padding, let me zoom closely so you can see. Here we can actually control the sizes we are giving to this particular element. So we can give it a padding right of 33. As you can see, the element we have a padding right of 33, and you can further control that from this particular angle. I hope you get that point very clearly. So we talked about gapping also. Gapping is the difference you create, the space you create between an element without using margin. Okay, we talked about using margin. It's also okay to use margin in most cases, but gapping makes things very easy and seamless. For instance, we have multiple of these elements all around here. Okay, and in this one we remove the padding we added, so we can select on the elements outside it and give it a gap of whatever size we want, possibly a gap of 77. You see, it spaces out all elements accordingly. Unless you want to select this and give this a specific space that is different from these other spaces, then you can use margin to do just that. But what's practically happening here is because we are giving it a margin with the class. Okay, so whenever you add in a margin, make sure you add a margin with an ID if you want to specifically give a margin spacing of an element for that particular element area. Okay, so that's what we learn about margin, padding, and gap. And in Flexbox, we get to understand that this is the way we control an element inside a div. All elements inside this div can actually be controlled, pushed to the left, pushed to the right, center aligned, middle aligned, bottom center, bottom left, bottom right, bottom whatever. This is the controls you have, and we have done a lot of practicals on this. Okay, now we move further to the CSS grid, which is the final level of this. Okay, so in the CSS grid, we learned that we can practically move elements or control element sizing, okay, according to what we want it to be. So it's not just about moving an element left to right, but it's further control. We actually use this as an instance. When we enable the CSS grid from this angle, we can actually give an element, tell an element how many of it we want to appear in a row and a column. So for instance, if we go back to what we have from here, let's delete this. So we can practically select on this element and convert it to a grid layout. So now we select on a grid layout, can tell this count automatically is on 1, which means one must have to stretch from the beginning to the end of that particular layout. Okay, now we are giving it a 3 count. It's gonna put in all those 3 elements to that particular row. If we practically duplicate this, it goes under and it keep adding up to this elements until it gets to 6, and at the 7th one it goes under. Okay, and we further said that you can practically select on the div guiding everything, then scroll down until you find the child span overriding. So we can select on the child span overriding, and here we can give it a column count of 2 to give it a space of 2 of that element, can give it a column count of 3 to space it all through. So we can have 3 elements at the top and we have just 1 element at the bottom part. So that is it about the CSS grid, and that is everything we have for this particular module. I hope you understand it. Our quiz will be below this particular lecture, okay? And we have a very simple assignment following that quiz. I'll see you in the next class.